Okay, folks, let's go ahead and get started. This is the invited speaker session on socioeconomic issues of AI in agriculture. And I guess just a couple of housekeeping notes. For those of you who are speaking, you've got a lapel mic that Brian's wearing, so just please remember to swap that out before you speak. Roughly the talks are going to be 25 minutes total, including questions, so we're probably going to have about 20 minutes, and then I'll walk around with a mic. If you have a question, just raise your hand. I'll come to you with a mic so everybody can hear. And with that, our first speaker is Dr. Brian Whitaker from Oklahoma State University. Brian, I'm going to let you do a more detailed introduction, so thank you.
All right, is this mic working? You guys hear okay? All right, great. Thank you, Alex, for having me today. I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a spiel about why I think you guys chose me to be here. But first of all, good job picking the right session, right? This is going to be a way better session than what they have over there. So great job. This is a way bigger issue, which I'm going to hopefully convince you guys of today. So as Alex mentioned, I'm at Oklahoma State University. I'm an ag economist, but I'm a little bit of an anomaly in the ag econ department, and is that I don't do a whole lot with pure ag. And so I'm going to talk to you guys about what most of my work focuses on, and I'll get into that here in just a second. But here's what I plan to talk to you guys today about. I want to give you kind of a broader perspective on what AI and technology in general has meant for the U.S. labor market. Then I'm going to go into kind of what I focus on, which is kind of broadband in rural America. Particularly, there is a working group at the Federal Communications Commissions about what kind of connectivity that agriculture needs. So I'm going to discuss that briefly. Get into some very recent research on what broadband means for rural economies, which is again kind of where I focus. And then we have this whole policy situation unfolding of there is supposed to be money coming for rural broadband, both wired and wireless. We don't know what's going to happen with that, and I'll try to get into that. So again, our little subgroup here of 4 people kind of made the decision to start with me because I'm going to kind of have some broader perspective on things. Then we've got a lot more detailed stuff for you guys in the later presentations. So here's me. This is my Google Scholar profile. The reason I put this up here, if you look at the papers that I have up there, pretty much everything says something about broadband and rural. Okay, so this is kind of what I do. They all talk about, non-metro digital divide. There's one on their farmers markets. That's kind of an anomaly. But the rest of them are like, what does the internet mean for rural communities? Does it impact jobs? Does it impact civic engagement? Why don't farmers use the internet? Here's my next most highly cited works, all the same stuff. Okay, so the reason I put this up there, and this is my overall productivity. Trust me, these are not impressive numbers. I think Dr. Reed has like 10 times this number of citations and stuff like that. But the reason I put this up there is because, like a lot in this field, this topic is growing. Okay, people who are working in this are getting cited. There's more work to be done. We know there's a lot of excitement in this whole conference, and so again, I hope you guys, especially you graduate students, continue along this path. There's a lot of good work to be done here, and I hope you guys contribute to that in the future. And just as a finisher for this one, here's my more recent stuff that I've done just in the past year or two. Again, talking about what broadband means. We have a subsidy program for broadband now. At least one of these I'm going to talk about later on when I talk about the kind of current research on economic development in rural areas. Okay. So here is the paper that I want to start off with on this broader perspective of AI. And these are not ag economists, but economists in general, these 3 guys right here. And they're actually really good economists. This guy was actually the president of Harvard for a while. These guys are elite Harvard economists. They do really amazing work. And so I want to kind of go over this paper that they just put out. I linked it down here in case you want to take a look at it. But you can see the high-level overview here. They go over some really cool data from the census going back over a century on like what type of jobs we have, what types of jobs are growing, shrinking, and really what's happened as these kind of innovative things have happened over time. Things like steam power, electricity, right? That popped up during this period, so we can kind of see what has that meant for jobs over time. And you can see kind of some of the key takeaways right here, but I'll get into them as I've got like 3 charts on this. I think it's pretty interesting, and they even give a kind of an early look at what AI might mean for one particular industry. And again, it's kind of a broader perspective on things. So here's kind of the main chart that they look at, again, going back to 1880. Probably doesn't surprise a lot of people that, yes, we did have a lot of people employed in farming back in 1880, 1890, and that has declined over time, right? That's kind of this first point. Yes, we had about 40% of people, of all jobs, were in farming back then, only a small fraction of that today. But the key takeaway here is that That's because mechanization was a good thing, right? Yes, we did have people transition out of agriculture, but they took on other jobs, okay? Those jobs just didn't disappear. That's kind of a key recurring theme in their work. Same thing with what he's calling blue-collar jobs. You know, we had a big chunk of blue-collar jobs, so that's things like manufacturing, construction. We saw that decline during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, down from about 40% to 20%. Again, same thing. That's because of technology, right? We had these huge improvements in factory work, in work productivity, and a lot of the people that transitioned out of jobs here transitioned into jobs here in the professional sector, okay? So it's this idea that because innovation happens, it doesn't just remove jobs, which is kind of this automation anxiety we hear a lot about. It's, you know, we can potentially have pluses or minuses associated with that. And they make the point in this paper, here's what they call automation innovations, where again that employment does decline in the particular industry. They also point out that you can have what they call augmentation innovations. So in this office administration positions, this is where jobs can actually improve because it either increases the amount of tasks you have to do or just the different types of work that become available. Okay, so these are the kind of different distinct categories of labor that they look at, and what they basically do in the next in the remaining parts of the paper, I'll go over this in the next couple of slides. This is what they call labor market churn. And so this is kind of an interesting thing. They basically look at, okay, let's see, we know that farming declined over between 1880 to 1890. Let's say it went from 40% to 30%. That's what they call a 10% labor market churn, okay? Similarly, if services rose from 15% to 20% over a 10-year period, that's another 5% labor market churn. And so they look at every 10 years, they calculate this number of occupational churn, people switching labor categories, and they basically show that it was a really big disruption when we moved kind of initially from agriculture to other parts of the industry. Okay, so that was a really high labor market churn back at the turn of the century, around 1900. And then we had another really big shift when we went away from the railroads back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s into the more personal automobiles. Okay, so that was another big labor market churn. But their takeaway here is that after 1970, pretty calm. Okay, so everybody has this kind of big automation anxiety. There was this paper in the 2010s written by economists saying, oh my gosh, 50% of all jobs could potentially be replaced by automation. Well, historically, it's not such a big deal, right? We see, labor market churn rates of about 10% total, whereas historically they've been up to 15, 20%. It's not as big as maybe some people would have thought. Okay, so and then the last chart I want to put up here from this paper is this idea of job skill level. So they show these kind of low, medium, and high skilled jobs and how they've changed over time. And back in the 2000 and 2010s, they say this is evidence of job polarization. So we had gains in low and high skill, but big losses in the middle. Okay, so that happened in 2000 and 2010 also. But more recently, we see what they're calling skill upgrading. Okay, losses in the low and medium, but gains only in the high skill. So this is evidence, they say, that people are learning the skills appropriate for this kind of technology that we're seeing. And so they argue that's a good thing. And then the last thing from this paper I want to point out is, even though we're way too early to say what the impact of AI on the industry, on all occupations are, they do say that there's some evidence for how it impacts retail sales. And the reason they can say that is there's one particular employer in retail sales that has made a lot of use of kind of predictive ability in, again, kind of since around the 2010 period. Anybody know who I'm talking about here? There may be somebody on the phone using it right now. Yeah, Amazon. Okay, so Amazon has been a huge, it can tell you what you want, it can predict what your local labor market likes or local market conditions like. And so as you see in 2010, we see this huge employment drop, and this is just retail sale occupation. So we see a really big drop in terms of the number of employees in that industry. At the same time, this is the productivity in that industry surges during the 2010s. Okay, so same idea, we get really great productivity increases, but employment's dropping. Where are those jobs going? Are they just becoming unemployed? Probably not. They're probably taking jobs elsewhere, which is part of that upskilling or restructuring that we talked about, labor market churn. Okay, so that's all I'm going to talk about with those Harvard guys. Now I'm going to go into broadband in rural America, ag connectivity needs. This is kind of more along my work. Anybody know what this thing is up here? 56K modem. I play that sound for my students nowadays. They have no idea what we suffered through back in the days, right? This is a brutal thing to listen to. I play that sound, they don't even know what it is. So when I first started doing research on what broadband means, we were defining broadband as 200 kilobits per second, right? A whopping 4 times faster than our 56K modem. We thought that was blazing fast speeds back in the 90s. Not anymore, right? The FCC defined it as 4 megabits down, 1 megabit up in 2010. We see how that's changed over the years. Just last year, they switched to this current definition, 100 megs down, 20 megs up. You can see some headlines from that. And of course, this is really kind of technology agnostic. We hear a lot about, does that mean fiber? Does that mean satellite? It's really whatever technology can get you these speeds, okay? I can talk more about why fiber might be better. It can do gigabit speeds, why fixed wireless might be able to reach this, might not. But for the purposes of this conference, we are talking about any technology, including wireless. And so I know a lot of you in this room probably deal more with wireless speeds. So the 4th generation of wireless probably can, in some instances, reach this threshold. Not always. When you get to 5G, you probably are talking about at least this. But again, there's differences between rural and urban connectivity with 5G. Okay, so that's the official definition of broadband. What does the FCC say happens with broadband? The problem here is that the FCC is mostly looking at population when they talk about broadband. So their reports, this is their latest 2024 report that uses data from 2022, they look at how many people in rural versus urban areas are connected. Perhaps unsurprisingly, it's really good in urban areas, not as good in rural areas. You can see the gap here for 120 speeds. For those faster speeds, again, about a 20 percentage point gap here, and still even there, only not even half of urban areas can get this kind of gigabit speed that we've come to discuss now. So that's part, I'm going to mention more about this in a second, but most of the FCC's data on broadband is focused on population, not necessarily crops, right, acreages. And so we'll get into that. There is a really important working group within the FCC called the Precision Agricultural Technology Working Group. These guys meet every year. They come up with these huge annual reports. This thing's 130 pages. What do they say is necessary for ag connectivity? Well, they say at the field level, for acreages, we need 100 service, and at the farmhouse, farmstead, we need gig service. Okay, so that's their recommendations. They are continuing to push for this 5G wireless, which is a big deal in rural areas. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So this is kind of where we stand. The next slide I have talks a little bit more about the actual, so this is some of the talking points from this Precision Ag Task Force. We have had some great examples throughout this conference of how agriculture is using these different technologies, and I thought these were some good quotes, recognizing that AI is coming sooner rather than later, talking about the types of files. I thought this was kind of cool. They actually had AI generate the graphics that they use in their report. I thought that was kind of a neat thing to do. And again, we've heard a lot about this, including what Dr. Reed talked about, measuring, mapping a farm, measuring moisture, soil maps, predict weather, all this kind of stuff, and use that to increase the productivity of your farm, generally speaking. And again, they've had some nice examples of drone operations, the type of connectivity they need for this work to happen. Basically, it gets back to these broadband definitions that we mentioned. And again, just it can be used in all kinds of different aspects of farm management. These are all, again, examples that probably John could have done a better job of putting together. And the point I want to make here is that we've transitioned here recently into how we gather broadband data. We now have this thing called the Broadband Serviceable Location Fabric. And that focuses on basically buildings. Okay, so it identifies literally every building in the US, and it classifies them as either a business or a residence. And the problem with that is not everything is a business or residence, right? So it's basically ignoring agriculture, other points that are out there. In the early versions of this data, there were classifications for agriculture and land, and I actually got my hands on that back in 2021. I think this was available. And unsurprisingly, those are the type of structures that were most likely to not have good broadband service. But the FCC is essentially not counting those anymore. They're only looking at businesses and residences, and so this is unfortunately the way that they've decided to move forward. Here's an example from a rural county in Oklahoma. You can see the green here are the agriculture structures back in 2021. Unsurprisingly, they're probably more, further away from these households, and again, in places where there's just bad broadband connectivity, which is kind of expected, right? So unfortunately, we don't really have this data updated regularly through the FCC because they've chosen to focus on households and businesses. And one thing that came out of that FCC working group is, well, they recommend that we focus on mobile coverage over those acreages and not just households and businesses. Okay, so I think it's a great suggestion. We'll see if they move forward with it. Okay, I want to talk about some recent research on broadband, ag, and economic development, including some of my own work. And here is a paper that John Green with the Southern Rural Development Center, sitting right there. He'll be talking to you guys tomorrow. We worked with him to kind of put this little issue brief together. And it says, what matters more for economic development? Is it just the availability, which is basically an infrastructure issue? Does that matter? If you bring in broadband to an area, does that automatically generate business growth, more income levels, all those kind of things that we associate with economic development? Or is it adoption, meaning people signing up for maintaining that subscription? Again, that's kind of a consumer demand issue. So what we did, we pulled together all the studies going back through to, I think, 2021, 2022 on availability and economic development. Here's the other ones on adoption and economic development. What the literature basically shows is they do both matter. But if you look at the ones that focused on both, try to see what the stronger relationship was for, it is for adoption. Okay, so we know, yes, you do have to have availability to get adoption. And honestly, I think this is kind of a parallel to what we talk about with AI and ag. We can get the technology there, right? We can make it available, but it's getting people to use it, right? To productively use it to have an impact on society, on their farm generally, and here on a broader economic development scale. Here's a study I'm kind of proud of. We just came out with this last year. And so we looked at, of course, all these studies over here, again, they're through 2021, 2022, use kind of lower thresholds of broadband. So at that time, we still had, 25.3 was the threshold. We've just now moved into the 120. And so we asked the question, does having faster speed mean you're going to have better, in this case, one particular component of economic development, which is more business bursts, more entrepreneurs show up, more businesses being born. And so what we did, we looked at a pretty low granular level of places that got, good broadband service, this 100 megabit service. We look at, the FCC data kind of shows where it pops up over time. And then we could compare those places with otherwise similar places, right? Same levels of education, same racial composition, same income levels, those kind of things. And this is where the 100 megabit speed was introduced. And this is what we call an event study. So it's best case scenario before that 100 megabits was introduced. The control and treated groups are basically the same. And then, as we had hoped to see, frankly, over time, the first year it's introduced, we do see an increase in those number of businesses. And then again, kind of growing over a 4 or 5 year period here. So we do show, yes, if you make this broadband available, it does seem to have an impact on business bursts. And so we then moved on to, okay, 100 megabits is good, but what about places that had 250 megs versus the control group now has 100? Okay, so it's a little bit faster speed. Does that have an impact? Well, again, pretty much here we say before that speed was introduced, they're pretty comparable. Once they get the faster speed, it does look like there's something here, right? So more businesses do appear to pop up for this 250 megabit speed. And then moving on to gigabit, looks pretty good here. The problem why I say maybe here is there's some problems before this. It's not, we want to see this right along this line. This is our kind of event study. We want to see them exactly similar before this, and then it take off. This is kind of problematic, so we can't make a really great claim there. Okay, so this is a study that has moved beyond just does broadband matter to what kind of speeds matter. Here's some other work by colleagues more focused on ag. Catherine is at the Consumer Federal Financial Protection Bureau. She looked at broadband penetration and farm productivity, and she makes the case that when you do have this internet penetration increase, you see things like crop yields improve, which she frankly attributes to precision ag, to the kind of stuff that we're talking about at this conference. And she also shows, I don't have the chart on here, but she shows that expenses per farm decline, which basically she's saying they're going out and being able to shop at, shop their inputs at more competitively and basically buy stuff cheaper and use the online tools to help them manage their business better. Same thing for this paper by some colleagues in, I think these guys are at Penn State. They evaluated what we call the Broadband Improvement Program, or Broadband Initiatives Program, sorry, and they looked at farm productivity, and they basically said when you do have a farm in a county that got some of this money, you got higher growth in sales per capita. So it does look like broadband matters for farms. The exact method or mechanism is still kind of to be determined, but I think it's a lot of what we're talking about at this conference. And the last thing I want to talk about is this funding for broadband. So you guys may have heard there's a lot of money right now in the pipeline for broadband infrastructure. In particular, there's something called BEAD, Broadband Equity Access and Deployment. Broadband funding, these are in dollars million. So basically all the states here in the South are getting over $1 billion. Okay, that's a lot of money in the broadband world. We're looking for, and again, this is the dollars that are focused on those residences and businesses that don't currently have broadband. They are pushing these dollars out there. So there's again $42.5 billion across the whole country. In my state, Oklahoma, we got about $800 billion. This money has actually already been spent. It was a consumer subsidy program that we ran in 2023 and 2024. It ran out of money and they didn't bring it back. And this pocket of money right now is kind of a bad word in the federal government, so we're wondering if that's going to come through. And even the $42 billion now, we still hear rumblings about problems with the program. We're not sure it's going to continue. And this recent federal funding freeze creates this considerable uncertainty. This money has essentially already been allocated to states, but have not been rolling it out yet. So we frankly don't know what's going to happen in the near future. And then the last thing, 5G fund for rural America, clearly important for the work that we're talking about here. This is a report from late last year from the FCC. They have done some work on 5G over the years. This was a recent announcement that, yes, we're going to continue this work, and we're going to try to allocate $9 billion to it, which is, again, a good chunk of money. That was in December. More recently, the question is it going to survive? We know already, this is the current FCC commissioner who says these programs remain plagued by inefficiency. This is a report from the Government Accountability Office showing all these different funding programs within the federal government, which is frankly not a good look right now. And we think there's a high likelihood that a lot of this is going to be up in the air. And so what's been planned in the past couple of years, we really don't know how it's going to play out, like a lot of things right now. And again, a lot of the people involved in this 5G work want to hold off on this $9 billion until some of this money has been allocated, until they figure out what they can do, how they can leverage the investments already made. And so I think that's all I have for you guys. Happy to take any questions about rural development, broadband, any of that stuff.
Thanks, Brian. We have time for a question or two, so if you have one, David, raise your hand, I'll bring it to you.
Thanks, Brian. David Mulla here. Where does Starlink fit into all of this?
Great question. So if you go to this, the BEAD program, the $42.5 billion, initially the way it was laid out, there was a strong preference for fiber. And essentially Starlink satellite was not allowed due to it couldn't hit the 120 threshold. There was latency issues. Since this time, it's become a talking point that, hey, maybe we should move away from fiber. Maybe we should relook at whether satellite technology is allowed. We're still up in the air on that right now, but it does look like the push right now is to potentially push more to satellite.
So thanks for that. I'm just reminding the people who are online that if you have a question, please put it in the chat and we'll try to get to those. Other questions from the audience here? Probably time for one more. Okay, I think you explained everything perfectly, Brian, so thank you so much.
Absolutely.
So our next speaker is Jonathan McFadden, and Jonathan's going to be speaking on automation and digital agriculture in the U.S. and Mississippi, trends, drivers, and impacts. And I'm going to allow Jonathan to introduce himself in a little more detail. So thanks, Jonathan.
All right, thanks, Alex. Can everyone hear me? Is that okay? All right. Yeah, so I'm Jonathan McFadden. I'm at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And as Alex said, I'm going to be talking a little bit about automation and digital ag in the U.S., sort of comparing the U.S. and Mississippi using some nationally representative data that we have. So, yep. Oh, even closer. Okay. How's that? Is that any better? Weird. What about now? Ah, okay. I could just alternatively shout. How about that? Is that pretty good? All right, perfect. Okay. So, we've now sort of hit some of these topics many times over the past near 2 days. We know that digital agriculture and precision agriculture, if these technologies are adopted at scale, they have a whole host of economic benefits, things ranging from, increases in farm productivity to input efficiency. We haven't talked as much about environmental performance improvements, but there are some real possibilities for that, as well as quality of life enhancement, which is something that we as economists tend to not talk nearly as much about for how important of an issue it actually is, and actually how relatively straightforward it is to actually quantify, even though it seems like that might be challenging. So, some of the reasons, or a big reason why, we stand to gain really the transformation of U.S. agriculture from these types of technologies is indeed because of artificial intelligence, things like machine learning, and the opportunity to sort of have continual improvement of farm management and production. But just to really nicely sort of dovetail and play off of what Dr. Reed just sort of talked about in his keynote address earlier, I think we can learn things about what's happening to the world in which we'll be experiencing over the next 1 to 2 to 3 years by actually going back in time and thinking about the time path of conventional precision agriculture, because a lot of economists have found that the drivers of adoption for AI, at least for the stuff that isn't completely fully autonomous, is very similar to the drivers of adoption for partially automated technologies, so things like auto steer. And so really what I'm going to spend a lot of my time today talking about in the talk is sort of the economics of adoption with respect to auto steer. Okay, so one thing that I like to do in talking a little bit about sort of the economics of precision ag and digital ag is first sort of talk through these particular concepts, because they can mean different things to different people. And I know we have sort of a room full of engineers here, a room full of economists and some sociologists, so we know perhaps it would be a good idea to sort of talk about what I mean in particular. And so the first wave of a lot of these types of technologies were sort of what we would call sort of site-specific analog technologies, and this would include things like simple soil testing. You take test a core out on your field and send it to the lab and see what the chemical properties are. Paper-based yield maps, or soil maps, paper-based pest infestation maps, and so on. And then we started to get increasingly sophisticated with conventional precision ag, so yield monitors, variable rate technologies, guidance systems, which I'll talk more about. And then sort of into the common day with things like digital ag, and I kind of think of that term fairly broadly. I tend to think that also incorporates some aspatial or some non-site specific technologies. So, I do work at USDA broadly on the economics of technology adoption and technology impacts, including things like genetic engineering and gene editing. So I would argue that, gene editing is also a part of digital ag, things like blockchain, and so on. So that's a little bit about sort of what these relationships look like. But then, of course, we're at an AI conference. So what about AI? So can we sort of keep going with this? And again, depending on you talk to different people in sort of the socioeconomic spectrum, you'll get kind of different answers about what all this means. But there was a really nice piece that came out in the annual review of resource economics just last year by a couple of different folks, and they sort of had a categorization that was based on the technology, broad categories for the technology, examples of functionality, and then potential economic benefits. And so things like measuring or describing, so we could use ML to detect different stages of ripeness for fruits or veggies, which might increase efficiency, through to site-specific management, so AI-based assessment of fertility needs, and then just completely robotic application. Prediction, of course, is something we all are very familiar with in terms of use of ML for, and then all the way down to recommendations to improve decision support systems. And so, if you're thinking about a topology that looks like that, again, a lot of the things on the left sort of are similar to what we've been talking about in precision ag for many, many years. There's the site-specific stuff that I just talked about on the previous slide. So again, it's not really too crazy to think that we can learn a little bit about the direction of AI by going back, in time. So I'll just talk a little bit about trends here. I'll give you a slide or two on potential economic impacts from some research that I've been doing recently on auto steer, and then finally and wrap up with a couple of opportunities and challenges. So, before I start talking about the trends, though, I just wanted to sort of give a quick shout out to the data that I'm going to use. It's the Agricultural Resource Management Survey, otherwise known as ARMS. It's a main source of information to USDA and Congress about production practices on farmers' fields, but as well as the well-being of farm households all across the lower 48. It's a field level survey that's done, at the field level is a survey that's done for target commodities every 4 to 6 years. And so we started asking about farmers' adoption of precision ag all the way back in 1996. Every year or 2 or 3, we come out with a new report that sort of measures, nationally representative adoption estimates, which I'll draw upon here. In our so-called phase 3 of the survey, it's a farm level survey. It goes out to about, in any given year, anywhere between 15,000 to 30,000 farms, again, across the lower 48, and it's designed to be representative nationally, but representative at the state level in terms of about a dozen different targets. So farm size, farm specialization, and so on. And, we were fortunate. I got a question into this survey back in 2023 about precision ag, which is the first time ever that that's been done. You can get some data on precision ag adoption from the Census of Agriculture, but it's very aggregate. It's a simple yes, no. Do you have precision ag? So this was the first time that we have, really nice nationally representative data, all 48 states, for about 8 or 9 different technologies, and I'll show you a slide of that. And so in the talk, I'll just emphasize adoption in the most recent years, 21 to 23, but some of the stuff goes back to 2015. And so the first slide here I'm showing is just adoption rates in terms of percent of crop planted area for 6 different crops. I'm actually borrowing this from a paper that we wrote for the International Conference on Precision Ag last year with a co-author, Bruce Erickson, who was also in the room here. And depending on particular crop and depending on technology, you see vastly different adoption rates. So, for something like yield monitoring here in orange for corn, we're at 70% of planted acres in 2021, 79% in soybeans. But again, the focus of my talk here is going to be really on auto steer. We first started asking about auto steer in 2000 to 2001, and we've seen this really rapid, increase in adoption for various reasons, which I'll talk about here in a minute. Notice that you get a lot of different variability depending on technology. Here in maroon, we have, variable rate, which is sort of in the 20s to 30s%, depending on the particular type of crop and year. And then down at the bottom, of course, well, maybe not of course, but down at the bottom is drones. Drone use just isn't very large, despite all of the hype that we hear about in the farm press. And that's for also a lot of different reasons that we could spend a lot of time on, but I won't today. Okay, so this is the graph on auto steer again. Going back to 2001, it was very, very low at around 5% of planted acres in corn. Similarly, though, for soybeans, and it wasn't really until the mid-2000s that we sort of have this takeoff. And as of, 2019, It's adopted on, just under 70% of planted acres of cotton. So really over a 2-decade period, this is really remarkable growth. I do some work on adoption of genetically engineered crops. So if you plotted this versus adoption of some insect-resistant or herbicide-tolerant crops, you'd see something that looks somewhat similar. So really a huge success story. So, it begs the question of why is that? What are sort of the underlying economics? And we'll get there here in a minute. But before that, I just wanted to show you a different sort of cut of the data. And so this is looking at adoption rates for auto steer in 2015 for cotton, 2019 for cotton, 2018 for soybeans, 23 for soybeans. For the United States in blue and sort of in this yellow gold for Mississippi. And so, by and large, we see, Mississippi being very similar to the United States as a whole. Interestingly enough, it was way ahead of the curve for cotton in 2015, and things started to tighten up a little bit by 2019. Of course, these bars here, the 95% confidence intervals are fairly wide, and that's just a mechanical outcome of the fact that, we only survey about 80 to 120 Mississippi growers. And so we just have, larger standard errors. Okay, so what does the distribution of adoption look like by farm size? And so here I'm plotting out adoption by small, mid-sized, and large farms. That's, at ERS, the Economic Research Service at USDA, what we mean by small, mid-sized, and large is fairly technical. A small farm is defined to be a farm that has a gross cash farm income of $350,000 or less annually. Mid-size is $350,000 to $1 million, and large is $1 million or more. And so it probably doesn't surprise really anyone in the room to see that you have this pretty large increase in adoption as you go higher up the farm size distribution. Here in Mississippi, we're at about 80% adoption, as a whole. So 80% of farms in Mississippi as a whole adopting auto steer if they're large family farms. On the low end of things, pretty minimal. And so, at least from the perspective of economists that have pretty good data on this is actually quite surprising to us. We all know about this thing called the digital divide, but just to sort of see that adoption is just so low on small farms was, at least for me, unexpected. So we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. So we also asked for the first time, why do farmers adopt and why do farmers not adopt? And so we have some stated reasons. It was a choose all that apply here. And here again, I'm plotting U.S. versus Mississippi, and operator fatigue is a huge one, just as Dr. Reed here talked about an hour ago. So of the farms adopting, 60% of adopters of auto steer do so because it reduces operator fatigue. Another big one is saving labor time, and yet another large one is reductions in input costs. Another interesting thing is sort of the default option. Well, it wasn't really an active choice so much as, well, it was already on my equipment. And so that's also a non-trivial thing as well, certainly playing a role in our 70% adoption rate for yield monitors, to be sure. So we have this, but we also asked the non-adopters why they didn't adopt, and we got some interesting results with that as well. And when you design a survey that goes out to specialty crop growers, dairy, cow, calf, and so on, you're going to get a lot of responses where it's just not relevant, right? So if you ask, farms that only grow corn and soybeans, why aren't they adopting robotic milking? The answer is pretty obvious, right? So we wouldn't necessarily expect, this large percentage to be really that striking, but still, nonetheless, I think it really gets at this idea that you really have to tailor the technologies to solve a problem for farmers, and if you're not doing that, then you're not going to get customers. Beyond that, relative costs, costs relative to benefits play a role. Really not a lot going on with things like too complicated or not accurate enough. And clearly there's room for improvement in how we phrase the question as well, given that we have a non-trivial amount of people saying, well, perhaps it's something else. Okay, so that's a little bit about what adoption looks like for auto steer, using some representative data. Now, what are some of the impacts? And so I know this table is a bit too technical and a bit too small, but I'll just walk us through it. So what I'm doing here is I'm estimating what economists would call a production function. So, how does output relate to various types of inputs? And I'm doing that as a function of auto steer right here on the top. And I'm estimating a particular type of production function called I don't want to get too into the weeds here, called a constant elasticity of substitution. But I think that's important, that word elasticity, because economists have been trying to get at that now for nearly a century. So we've heard talk after, I've heard talk after talk after talk talking about, well, is precision ag going to displace labor, or is it going to perhaps have a reinstating effect? So this idea of an elasticity of substitution is economists' way of getting directly at that. And it's been a burning question in our minds for the past 100 years. And so I'm not going to present those results today, but I do have some answers for that. But the key thing here that I'll point out is that, depending on model specification, you find pretty large, strong effects of auto steer on productivity. So in the most preferred model here in column 4, you find about a 6% effect. Now, you can ask, well, is that correlational, or is that actually, causational? And it's kind of a gray area. We control for a wide variety of things down here. So we think we're doing a fairly good job. It still might not be perfect, but, I'd be surprised if, the number was anything, substantially lower. So why is that? Well, in the paper, we go through and talk a little bit more about particular mechanisms, but I won't really get into the details here. Just on that, but I do think it's interesting that even after controlling for things like hours of steering, hours of work outside the cab, all sorts of variable inputs, so chemicals, fertilizers, labor, the share of capital assets, and so on, you still get this really nice 5-6% number. So, and you might think, okay, well, that's not a big surprise. We've been doing this thing now for decades. We know that there are these productivity effects. Well, the engineers might know that, but the economists less so. We don't have that kind of good non-experimental data, right? So, economists tend to not run, carefully controlled studies, right? This isn't a carefully controlled study. This is actually real world farmers in really, really messy situations, which is why we have to think really carefully about, what we're controlling for, basically. So, kind of a cost and benefit for that type of approach. Okay, so I'll just talk a little bit about now some opportunities and some remaining challenges. And again, I think this was, a lot of this was just mentioned here an hour ago with Dr. Reed, but also a lot of these were touched on really nicely in yesterday afternoon session about the CAST paper. So I won't spend a lot of time on these, but I'll choose to focus on one or two. So we know that, major drivers of farmers' use of these technologies are things like soil quality and topography, of course, farm size that we talked about. Another major one that is talked a lot about in the econ literature, but perhaps, well, I think to some extent a little bit less in the engineering literature, although I think Dr. Reed did a really great job, is human capital, right? So farmers' education, farmers' training, farmers' years of experience, on the farm, or even, at the field level or at the plot or parcel level. So, hugely important. What are some general barriers? Fixed adoption costs, of course, recurring, operational and maintenance expenses, limited use cases, user friendliness, and so on. And I was thinking about this earlier. If I had to sort of distill down what I think of as the major demand side issue and the major supply side issue, I would say on the demand side, it's trust, which again is something that we've heard, a little bit about earlier today as well as yesterday. And so I was asked by the OECD to write 2 reports for them a couple of years back, and I wrote a short paper for them in 2022 just on trust, just on sort of how these types of machine learning algorithms are black boxes that farmers don't understand, and who's going to help them learn about it. And I think, so in this particular piece, we talked about the importance of things like third-party certification. What types of parties do farmers trust? And can you get the people that they trust to then sort of verify the program? And that's really hard to do. I'm not a sociologist. I'll leave it to the folks in the panel to sort of get into that. But I always chuckle when I see surveys, and I'm guilty of this myself, when we ask farmers, what's your trusted source of information? And the question has to be a page long, right? Because family, friends, DTN, the progressive, right? It's all across the board, and some of those are mutually exclusive. So it's a really challenging thing, and I don't really know how you solve it. It's a really, really challenging thing. The supply side thing is easier, standardization. I know how that can be solved. I mean, we heard a little bit about the ISO standards earlier today. And so, it's committee work. It's tough, but at least, you just sort of, it's a war of attrition, and after you've sort of laid siege on it for a while, eventually you can hash out a standard. But I think, not to sound flippant on that, I think that's really, really beneficial. So in 2020, I was asked by OECD to do an economic analysis of their tractor codes. And I was delighted to hear one of the speakers earlier this morning bring up the OECD tractor safety codes. It's this long-run group of safety tests for tractors dating all the way back to the early 1960s. And so I had 60 years worth of international trade data, and I was able to sort of run a simple economic analysis of the trade data, and I found pretty large effects. So I really think you can't understate the role of standardization and interoperability. I found, at least in the case of the OECD tractor codes, about a 33% improvement in trade. So trade in tractors between two OECD tractor test code members, 33% higher. I found weak evidence of what's called the trade creation effect. So it also helps facilitate trade between a member and a non-member. So these things are really critical. And so I'm optimistic, and I'm really hopeful that we'll get standardization and interoperability here in the next several years. And then finally, of course, related barriers. I mentioned the digital divide earlier. There are all sorts of issues related to adoption on very small farms, not only in the United States, but outside of the US. And to the extent that adoption on small farms is a policy goal, that comes with its own unique set of challenges, some of which I've sort of listed here. So I'll go ahead and wrap up. Hopefully there's time for questions. And thanks for staying awake during the afternoon session.
Okay, I have a question right here. Dennis, I'll come to you in a moment.
Thank you. The idea of enhancing trust through third-party conformance testing, in principle, is good, but the problem with that is that those third-party conformance tests tend to be very expensive. So when you're in ag, the experience we have with that tends to be with machinery manufacturers and, for example, AEF certification, right? And paying thousands and thousands of dollars to prepare for and attend a plug fest on top of the cost for getting the certification is okay when you're Deere, CNH, or one of the big European manufacturers. But when you're a relatively small software shop, that is a lot less feasible. ISO itself doesn't mandate that conformance testing be done by third parties. In fact, there's this taxonomy of first, second, and third party certifications. And there's other groups, like the object management group, for example. They have these standards for like business process modeling and so forth. And they decided that instead of trying to take on all the overhead of standing up an organization for conformance testing and putting that burden on the users, what they would do instead is empower user communities to set up second-party certifications so that your customers can certify that to the extent of their knowledge your solution is conformant and so forth. How do you see that sort of approach to precision ag technology?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, and thanks for some of the the details about these voluntary certification programs, and in particular what's been happening with like AEF and AEM. So second party testing, that's interesting. I think it holds some potential, but again, I would sort of go back to whom do farmers trust, right? If you're having customers certify, well, farmers trust their friends. They might not trust, the neighbor farm, 3 miles over, right? So it becomes a challenge. But again, sort of taking it back to third-party certification, for a while, the Agricultural Marketing Service at USDA, AMS, was doing something called the Process Verified Program. And so, essentially for a fee, not anything, I think, nearly as drastic as some might imagine it would be, but for a fee, they could basically have USDA AMS go out and verify that a particular production practice that they said they were doing was in fact actually being done. And so I think there are some sort of economic models, and there is some sort of economic rationale for that type of program. Now, in today's environment, I'm not really sure, how that would really play out. But there are, as it's just a matter of financing and prices of the fees and things like that, it's a real challenge. But again, I don't think it's fully insurmountable.
Hello, Jonathan.
Hey, Thomas.
Thank you for the talk. This was excellent. I want to ask you, how does the USDA define adoption? Like, what's the main definition here? And the second thing is, if there are criteria by which you say this is a successful or high adoption rate, and of course, as a professor, does that then inform how funding is allocated? So, for example, if we see that, drones are not being adopted that much, does that mean that later on we're looking at a decrease in funding for drone-based, approaches?
Yeah, great. Both great questions. So, yeah, adoption is sort of on a continuous scale, and so, in this table actually of the impacts of automation, just in my own research here, I'm defining automation itself to be a continuous variable that ranges between 0 and 1, just for sort of mathematical tractability. But oftentimes economists sort of think of adoption as just a 0-1 thing. Did you have it or did you not? Where in fact it can be a spectrum, right? Okay, well, I'm thinking about adopting it. I've now used it on a small part of my field, and now I'm going to try to do a more rigorous experiment on the full, right? And it's just a matter of well, there's this old joke about economists. If they lose their keys in a parking lot, they just look under the lamppost for their keys, right? So we have questions on 0-1, did you adopt? And so that's how we define adoption, right? And so we could, and it would be sharper of us to think about adoption as being sort of this multi-pronged, multi-tiered thing. But the reality is, surveys are really expensive to run, and you add more questions about sort of this multi-pronged, multi-tiered thing, and that can make survey administrators unhappy. But at least at ERS, it's to some extent dealer's choice. It's the modeler's choice, so we don't really have an official definition. And then the second question, so mea culpa. Thanks for calling that out. I indeed used the word successful, and I shouldn't have. I'm charged with trying to be as objective and as neutral as possible, so you didn't hear me say that. It's been a case of rapid adoption in a 2-decade period. In terms of funding, if that's a question related to things like NIFA funding, I don't really have an insight on that. I wish I did. I just don't know. But good questions.
Well, thank you so much, Jonathan. We better end it there. So our next speaker is Diego Thompson from Department of Sociology here at Mississippi State University. And Diego, it's all yours.
The opportunity. When I was asked about, when I was invited to present today, I thought, well, maybe this is I wasn't sure about the audience that we were going to have at the conference, and I thought maybe it's a good opportunity to pitch for sociology and social sciences. Assuming that we were going to have a lot of people from engineering and also other disciplines, but not social sciences. So my apologies for those who are social scientists and sociologists in the room, because you might see some overlap with some of the things that I'm going to share with you today. I'm not sharing any specific study about AI and autonomous technology in agriculture. What I'm sharing today is just an overview of the existing literature that exists on AI and autonomous technology in agriculture, and also literature that historically have been developed by social sciences when we look at the development of technology, adoption, and use. So hopefully some of the points that I'm going to share with you today can be used for future research or maybe facilitate good discussions. So AI and autonomous technology may include many different things that have been described during the conference. Some of you in the room may know more than me about the specificities of this technology, but could include drones for crop monitoring, spraying, and mapping, or scouting, autonomous tractors, self-driving tractors, or equipped with GPS technology and advanced software, agricultural field robots, GPS guided harvesters, weed and pest control robots, irrigation systems also, and other precision farming systems. And we also can consider other AI technology not listed here. So working with some colleagues from Mississippi State, including Bengalu Fisang, who is here in the room, and also Dr. Xiaofei Li, who is also here in the room, we've been doing literature review about how social scientists have addressed autonomous technology in agriculture. I'm not going to go into details about this particular paper that we haven't published yet, but we are going to share tomorrow in the conference. But I'm going to draw on some of the things that we found doing literature review, and also, as I mentioned before, literature review that have existed, literature that had existed in social sciences looking at technology and development in general, and particularly in rural context. We've seen studies that mostly have focused on adoption of autonomous agriculture, particularly looking at what are the implications and consequences of the adoption of autonomous technology, and to some extent also AI. Also, studies have addressed policy considerations, particularly looking at policy frameworks that exist, and some studies looking at human-robot interactions, which is a very fascinating topic. There are different factors that have been highlighted by the literature influencing human adoption, including technology-related factors such as farm characteristics that we saw in our presentation before. For example, the size of the farm, the things that are grown at the farms, etc. And also some environmental considerations that have been addressed by these studies. Some of the most remarkable things that we found doing this literature review is that the limited number of papers that have been published in social sciences, specifically about autonomous technology and AI. And also another thing is the limited geographical areas that these studies have addressed. Most of the publications have been mostly focused on developed countries, particularly in the US, Europe, and some countries in Asia also. But again, we are going to discuss this more in detail tomorrow. When I'm sharing are some gaps and critical aspects that I do think that are important when we look at AI and autonomous technology from a sociological or social science perspective. So one of the key things that we always find in the literature is questions about development and what is appropriate technology. Is it really appropriate technology that we are developing? There is always a dilemma that was indirectly addressed today in this section about between the discussions about small-scale technologies versus large-scale technologies, and how adoption and appropriateness may vary depending on the different scales that the technology covers or is developed for. We also have seen a slow technological adoption of particularly of autonomous technology, particularly in this has happened in developed countries, so it's even slower in developing countries. So what are the factors that may influence adoption of this technology? Some of the factors were addressed in our previous presentation, but the literature highlights other factors that I think are very important. One is skepticism and lack of trust that we were discussing with our previous presenter in this particular technology. And the literature has focused, again, mostly on the use or an adoption of autonomous technology. The other important aspect that may influence the adoption of AI and autonomous technology is the lack of awareness among farmers. Lack of education also about the technology, lack of education and knowledge about the capabilities of the technology, etc., which might be related to aspects of trust that were mentioned in our previous presentation. Also related to operational knowledge or capabilities in terms of the use of this technology on farms. Another key aspect is compatibility of this technology with existing, what I call agricultural practices and practices that farmers know on their farms, and the compatibility of this technology with things that they like, they prefer, or they feel familiar with. That's something key that has been studied, not only looking at the adoption of autonomous technology, but also any other type of agricultural technology or development of agricultural technology. Farmers usually highlight the aspect of compatibility. Am I going to be aware to, for example, get clean crops with this technology or not? Things like that. So looking at the convenience aspect of using this technology that was also mentioned in our previous presentation. And another thing that has been highlighted, which influences the speed and also willingness in the adoption of this technology, is the existing legal frameworks that exist in regard to AI and autonomous technology that currently significantly varies if we compare regions and even when we compare countries, right? It's not the same in the European Union than the United States, and this significantly shapes not only adoption, but also the development of these technologies. So more gaps and critical aspects that I think that are important to consider. Studies have suggested that the adoption could facilitate equitable and sustainable agricultural development that could focus on a specific social and natural context. This is something that have been highlighted here during the conference. But on the other hand, we also have heard concerns about the wide adoption of this technology, particularly when it's not triggered for a specific social and environmental context that could trigger unsustainable use of the natural resources and also create and or increase socioeconomic inequalities, in particular regions, countries, etc. So one of the key things that have been highlighted by the literature is that we need some type of rigorous analysis of appropriateness to look at what are the specific and human environmental contexts that are being covered by the development of this technology and where this technology is being used. And considering the literature that has existed in social sciences about the development of technology, I also added this particular aspect that I think is important, that is that this analysis of appropriateness has to be an ongoing process. In other words, and particularly in social sciences or in humanities, we can have or develop some type of uncomfortable or existential questions, going back, stepping back and saying, and asking, why this technology? What future do we envision? Those type of questions that we have learned from historically from agricultural development that has created negative human and also environmental externalities. We always have room for asking why this, and also, perhaps more importantly, what do we envision for the future when we think about our society and the use of natural resources? About perceived benefits from the use of AI and autonomous technologies, studies have shown that this type of technology can reduce, as also was highlighted before, can reduce financial costs for farmers, increase production, yields. It's an obsession for farmers, so this is something very, very important. And has been found by farm operators that have adopted this technology as more useful or convenient. So efficiency, precision, and cost effectiveness are key aspects to consider also when we think about AI and autonomous technology from social sciences or sociological perspectives. Other studies have also highlighted the relationship between humans and autonomous technology in farms, highlighting not only symbolic aspects in the relationship between humans and this technology, such as, for example, what this technology means for farmers. What are the meanings that they assign to the things that they do with this technology? Or, for example, what are going to be the consequences for human behavior or the time that people have if they adopt this technology? One of the key questions that many people have asked is, okay, if farmers adopt autonomous technology and AI, what they are going to do with the more free time that they are going to have. So that's a critical aspect for social scientists to consider and also to, of course, study. Another aspect that has been highlighted regarding to this is the decreasing physical demands on farmers and farm workers and how this could create some type of benefits among the population that adopt this technology. As I mentioned before, technological acceptance literature has highlighted perceptions of the usefulness of this technology, and perhaps more importantly, aspects of the compatibility that I mentioned before, the ease of operation, which is key and was also mentioned in our previous presentation. And of course, as also we discussed before, perceived economic advantage and existing legal framework. Another critical aspect that I believe is important to consider when we think about development, adoption, and use of AI and autonomous technology are aspects related to governance and relations of power. Decision making also in the development, adoption, and use. Whether or not people have the capability to be involved in the development, adoption, and use, whether or not people have the capability to make decisions about this technology. So co-development is something that has been proposed, and I've heard also in this conference as an alternative to development, for example, by only a few entities from the private sector. Another important aspect has been cybersecurity and data management, and also data ownership. It represents an important concern, not only for farmers, but also for the public. And this is something that has been highlighted in other conferences that I have attended about precision agriculture. So we can learn from precision agriculture, like we mentioned before, in terms of how we can study, and also how perhaps we can gain trust, public trust on these aspects. Aspects of monetary rewards and privacy of data sharing is another aspect that has been highlighted by the literature as something important to consider. Democratization in technological development and access for the the technology that is developed. And there is an important opportunity, I believe, on this aspect of governance and decision-making that is by generating multi-sectoral and multi-regional partnerships, things that have been discussed here in the conference, at least in the few sessions that I was able to attend for a few minutes yesterday and today. And this conference is an example of that, creating these spaces for discussion also. Another critical aspect from social science perspective or sociological perspective that has been also addressed today are related to inequalities, right? When we compare, for example, the scale in the use of this technology, when we compare farm sizes, for example, who are able to adopt this technology, right? We've seen that this technology has been adopted at a slower path among small farmers than larger farms. So those are key aspects that we need to consider. Also, when we look at studies, social science studies about the adoption of this technology, we find that the use of this technology, AI and autonomous technology in agriculture, has been mostly concentrated in developed countries like the US, and also European countries, as I mentioned before. And even when we look at the role of academics or scholars, and when we look at knowledge production, where these studies have been conducted, we also find that most of the production, most studies have been geographically concentrated in few countries in Europe, and mostly Europe and North America. So we also need to think about production of knowledge in other regions of the world. So key aspects related to inequalities that I think that are important are differences across rural communities and stakeholders, asking questions such as, is this technology going to create or increase inequalities? So those are things that could be considered for future research. Different aspects of AI and autonomous technology development can lead also to privatization and commercialization that could exacerbate inequalities that we have in our society. This could have consequences for especially historically marginalized farmers or small-scale farmers, and also small businesses that may not have the resources to adopt this technology. There is also public concern about this new technology in agriculture, as I mentioned before, but I believe, and this has been discussed also in the conference, that gaining public trust by providing access to information, creating robust regulations also, or clear regulations, and implementing inclusive programs could lead to more equitable outcomes when we think about inequality as a critical aspect. So based on these different points that I shared with you, I just listed some of the same aspects that I mentioned before about what is the future research or that could be done in regard to AI and autonomous technology. But of course, we can make this list larger based on other things that we are learning at the conference. But more studies could be done on looking at public perceptions, aspects of trust, for example, that is critical, as we mentioned before. We need definitely more studies about policy frameworks, looking at what are the policy frameworks that have been developed, particularly in other countries or regions, and see what are the things that we can learn from those policy frameworks and existing policies that not only shape adoption, but of course shape the development of this technology and the availability that exists in specific places. And of course, as I mentioned before, future research on socioeconomic impacts of this technology, which are critical. And what I mentioned before, which I think that is very important for social scientists and also people in humanities, the analysis of appropriateness as an ongoing process, right? Asking why are we doing this? How are we doing this, right? What are the externalities that the development of and use of this technology might be creating, and for what? Thinking about the future and questions such as, for example, what is going to be the future of human behavior, not only in relationship with this technology, but also with more free time that people may have, etc. With this, that's all I had. Thank you. And these are the references.
Question from David.
Thanks, Diego.
Yeah.
When sociologists are looking at tech adoption by farmers, some of the literature you've quoted made me feel like they were just looking at the farmer and not looking at the technology. For example, some of the work by Redhead and by Rial Lovera, they talked about the farmer being skeptical, the farmer lacking trust, and the farmer lacking awareness, rather than maybe the technology doesn't live up to its claims, or the technology doesn't have a clear impact, or the company hasn't marketed it well to that group of people. Is that typical, that it's looking only at the user as the at fault or negatively?
Well, I'm not sure if I can say typical, but that's the bias on my, bias aspect of the presentation based on what I've done on my career, working with farmers, and but that's a very important aspect to consider, right? That there might be other type of literature that specifically focuses on the private sector or those who are developing the technology that also addresses aspect of trust. And I'm not familiar with that particular field, but I think that's a great point. Yeah, I'm not sure if I answered your question, but yeah. That's
Probably have time for one more question if anybody has a. Diego, I'm going to throw out a question because I've thought about this a lot over the years, the idea of so-called leapfrog moves. I remember we were slower to adopt in the U.S. cellular phone technology than other countries were because we had landlines, right? Yes. And sometimes we think that the progression of technology has to follow a particular path, but sometimes it doesn't, that people who may be completely new to a technology can just start from here instead of having to follow that path. I'm curious if that, if you see how that fits into some of the things that we're doing, or if you've run across that in some of the literature that you've reviewed.
I'm not sure if I understood your question correctly, Alex, but I think that maybe you are referring to the analysis of appropriateness that I mentioned before. Is that?
I think that's part of it, yes.
Okay. That's what I think that is very important, right? To always looking at, evaluating what is being developed out there, and, work, creating partnerships and things like that. But yeah, I'm not sure if I answer your question.
It was a bit of an obtuse question, so okay. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you, Diego. Appreciate that.
I'm not sure if I.
Our next presenter is Allison Chatterjee from Cornell University. She's also here with one of our sponsors, AI Climate. So Allison, it's all yours.
Thank you so much. That's good? Okay. It's really nice to be here. I've always had a dream to come to Mississippi and Alabama. I told Dr. Thomason that. So it's great to be here. And I feel like meeting you, Diego, my presentation flows so perfectly from yours, and I hope that we can continue to work together. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the socioeconomic issues from a large standpoint, and then talk about how we've started to see those issues come up when we've engaged in stakeholder research with extension specialists, advisors through the Climate Smart Commodities programs, and now when we're reaching out to farmers and foresters. So I'm here with AI Climate, and Dr. David Mulla is here along with Dr. Bruce Erickson, my good colleagues on this project. This is an NSF and NIFA-funded AI institute, and our research objectives are really to address this grand challenge of climate change and how we can develop AI-infused models and tools to address this challenge and help farmers and ranchers and foresters adapt and mitigate climate change. So we're multi-institution, and I'm from Cornell in Ithaca, New York. Interestingly, the chicken that you had today was delicious, and it is, I believe, it's a Cornell developed recipe from our ag school. It's called Cornell chicken, so look that up. So this grand challenge, I want to start off with this because it hasn't gone away, and this is globally recognized, that agriculture is really in a pickle here. We started off the conference yesterday with hearing your president talk about how population is going to grow and that we need to be able to produce food for this growing population at the same time that agriculture yields are dropping. We have farms all over the world that are facing increasing drought, temperatures, heat stress, flooding, hail, you name it. And that's going to impact the yields when we need to be producing more food, and at the same time recognizing that agriculture is a large contributor to greenhouse gas emissions globally. In the US, it's about 11%. Globally, in other countries and the US, it's about 30% of emissions come from agriculture. So how do we address that? This is this concept of climate smart agriculture, which our institute is really focused on, climate smart agriculture and forestry. And how do we do that? We have to sustainably increase productivity and incomes for farmers while at the same time not further degrading water resources or land. We have to strengthen resilience or increase adaptation of farmers, and we have to reduce agriculture's contribution to climate change. This concept is growing globally. I have the great pleasure of attending the climate negotiations, the COP negotiations, every year since Paris, and agriculture has become an increasing focus of those talks. There's a food and agriculture pavilion every year. About 100,000 people are going to those talks, and agriculture is a big focus of that. And about 50 countries in their nationally determined contribution have a specific focus on CSA. So whatever AI tools we're developing here, Diego talked about globally, there is a need for these tools globally as well. So our program at Cornell was developed 10 years ago to really focus on climate smart agriculture, and that's the lens that I'm coming to this from. I think when I give talks about climate smart agriculture, I say to farmers that we can't really start addressing adaptation or mitigation without understanding what's happening on your farm. What are the energy sources you're using? What are the greenhouse gas emissions? What are the impacts that you need to adapt to? So those are really important as a starting point. Even for the AI tools that we are going to develop, we need to understand what's the need for them. So for example, there are many ways to mitigate, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, but also sequester carbon. But starting with a farm energy audit on a farm, starting with a greenhouse gas accounting, using a tool like Comet Farm, for example. This is this tool that was developed by USDA in partnership with Colorado State, and part of our AI climate project is to strengthen this and improve it by infusing AI models and data into that. I also think it's important when we're developing AI tools to think about what are the impacts that are affecting farms and what do they need to adapt to. So this is the data key statement coming out of the last National Climate Assessment. This is mandated by Congress. It will be done again in 5 years from 2028, a new assessment will come out, which acknowledges that climate change is happening and will affect agriculture. We need tools, we need better data, we need resources and research and extension support to help farmers adapt. And so when we think about adaptation, we also did a climate impacts assessment in my state. I co-authored the agriculture chapter. And what we know is that adaptation is not a one-size-fits-all. It's very, very specific. What it would be in Mississippi on a farm would be very different from what it would be in New York State, even across different producers or different agricultural commodities. So what we did is looked at different key commodities in our state. This one was dairy, livestock, and livestock products. We looked at all the climate impacts, including heat stress, drought, pests, extreme precipitation, and thought about these are all the climate smart practices that farmers could adopt to adapt to those specific impacts. And I would encourage you to think about when you're developing AI tools or technologies, how can the tools you're developing help farmers adapt to these impacts? How can they improve these adaptation practices? So this is another just way of saying that we, especially in a place maybe like Alabama, I'm gonna talk to the new farmer that I met, but in New York State, we are not like a monolithic, large-scale Iowa farm production. We have many, many different products where what we produce in Long Island or New York, Upper New York is very, very different. And so we need a variety of specific adaptation practices. And this is just a quote of a farmer and another farmer talking about how climate is affecting them. So I've been doing some work with the USDA Climate Hub to start training farmers on climate adaptation, really starting by teaching them about climate impacts and then really thinking about that process of planning. This is a tool that came out of the Northeast Climate Hub. I'm sure there is a similar tool, or this tool could be used with your climate hubs in different regions. There's a Southeast Climate Hub. And this is a growing degree day calculator from Cornell that we are starting to develop these kind of specific tools that use very specific climate data, and the farmer enters some data to understand how, for example, cumulative growing degree days are changing every day for the growing season, what would be the first frost and the last frost. And what I would love to see is to start incorporating AI into some of these decision tools. So kind of with that background, when we developed these tools, we were trying to think about what does the farmer need to know about how the climate is changing on a day-to-day basis. What kind of information how can we make this tool really user-friendly, easy to use, and we know that honestly, the people that are using this tool are most likely extension specialists or policy advisors. Some farmers are using it, but the idea like if you build it, they will come, not so. Really, it's not gonna happen. So if we develop these new AI tools and just hope that farmers are gonna use them, not so if they're not trusted, if they're not useful, user-friendly, or they're helping farmers to address a core challenge that they're facing. So with that in mind, I'm not gonna go into these issues because Diego, you did such a great job. I will provide this, and he provided amazing resources as well. I did go through those, that's not exhaustive, but what I could find through a search we've done, started to do a literature assessment through our AI Climate Institute. So pulling from some of that, We know that the key issues, again, are data reliability, privacy, ownership, and then this is kind of the Wild West out here. There's not enough policy that's been developed to guide AI and agriculture. Unequal access and adoption. One thing I didn't hear you mention, Diego, is just the age of farmers. The average age, I think, of a farmer is about 58 years old. It's been growing, and we need to think about, are these farmers able to use this technology, or is it going to have to be the younger farmers? On the flip side, maybe it's that we can get younger people interested in agriculture again by using some of this really cool technology. One thing that I really did want to focus on, I'm highlighting some of the challenges with AI. I hear, especially in our institute, and our focus is we are developing AI to help solve climate change, the climate challenge. What I don't often hear us focusing enough on in any of these rooms is the huge energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions from the growing use of AI. So I looked it up. To train a large AI model, a single large model can consume 600,000 pounds of CO2 emissions. Data centers are driving significant increase in greenhouse gas emissions. It's risen 48% just since 2019. You know, on your phone, when you do a simple search on your phone or your computer, it's seriously annoying. I just want a regular search, but at the top of everything now is an AI search. And to do that AI search is using a large percentage more of energy because of the need to power these huge data centers. What I would love to see, you ended with a call to research, Diego. I think it'd be really important that we are saying, we are promoting that our AI will help solve these environmental challenges, will improve fertilizer use, improve soil degradation, reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Well, I think we need to show the data on that and also compare the cost-benefit analysis of that against the energy used needed to power the AI to do that. The other environmental issues that we really need to think about are the land use destruction of putting these centers all over the world next to population centers, the noise pollution of these. If you sit on a local land board in Saratoga County in New York, there was huge outcry about one of these data centers going up, similar to huge outcry of large solar installations. So we need to really think about this, and also the water usage. So the last kind of challenge is, we heard that throughout this panel today, is trust and hesitation, and you'll see this come up when I present some of the data that we've started doing. So we've been trying to do stakeholder engaged research. A stakeholder is any citizen or group potentially affected by or who has a vested interest. So farmers, ag advisors, crop advisors, they are stakeholders that we need to be including up front when we're developing these models and tools. And so we at AI Climate have been developing a plan for a needs assessment. We want to gather and assess the views of various stakeholders and involve them in all stages of technology development, co-creation. I kind of cringe when I hear co-creation because I feel like we should have some farmers on our AI Climate panel and really be co-creation is really hard to do. Even engaging stakeholders and listening to them is really hard to do, to get their time and to get them involved. But it's a goal. We want to have them help us develop the tools that they need. And so we've been doing that through a number of ways. Bruce is in the room. I'm going to present some of his work really quickly, but he's engaged in developing a precision agriculture dealership survey with Purdue and Crop Life magazine. And that's been going on for many years. So actually, interestingly, you could look at the data over time, would be really interesting. I've been involved with a faculty member at Cornell who is Louis Longchamp, and he's developing a New York State survey on farm experimentation, digital technology, AI, and extreme weather, and that is going out right now. It has been really hard to get farmers to respond to that survey. And thinking about surveys, we had an iPad survey out at our table, which I'm really happy about 30 of you or more filled that out, which is awesome. But thinking about how challenging it is to get people to fill out surveys, I really enjoy doing focus groups. How many of you have ever participated in or run a focus group? Oh, that's awesome. They are really interesting. When we thought about like organizing a focus group about climate smart agriculture and AI, two kind of controversial terms, we're never sure what kind of input we're going to get, and we go in like, oh, we got to get this focus group done, and it's an hour-and-a-half conversation. Every single one of those I have left really being inspired by the people I'm listening to. It's a great conversation, and I always learn something. So I encourage you to engage in that. So I just want to really present quickly Bruce's work, and he's here to answer any questions. This was first done in 1997, so long-term data. The economics of technology adoption, it's still the case that the benefits of new technology are going to those adopters. It's lowering their per unit costs of production, and those that are maybe not adopting are put at a competitive disadvantage. This was some of what we heard from Diego. There are things that are faster adoption, including large grain and oilseed farms, GPS guidance, precision soil sampling, but not yet VRT, and yield monitors. The things that are still slow to be adopted are what we heard from Diego. Smaller farms are not yet adopting, specialty farms, non-mechanized farms, right? This makes sense. Remote sensing, vegetational or soil sensors, and variable rate technology, especially on these smaller farms. So for farmers, the cost of precision services is greater than the benefits. This is a key challenge, and farmers are interested in adopting precision ag, but still it's very costly, and we need to think about, again, when we're developing AI-infused tools, we have to make sure that it's going to be a benefit to them in terms of their farm income or their yields. And for dealers, it's difficult to find employees who can deliver precision services. We heard that earlier today about the need to educate the younger generation. And again, these tools and precision agriculture are still expensive. And we started, Bruce, for the first time this year, put a question on about AI, and this is really interesting to see that of the folks that filled out this survey, 45% feel that AI will lead to better agronomic recommendations, which is great, and will potentially reduce the need for employees and reduce operational costs. 21% agreed with that. So this is something that I think we can keep building on with Bruce to inform our institute work. And so now I want to talk about the focus group data that we have so far. These numbers don't look like a huge amount of people that we've talked to, but the amount of work to develop and get these people invited and get them to actually participate is huge. We are using undergrad students and a Working Lands Climate Corps recent graduate who's working at Cornell this year, along with a part-time project manager. So a lot of work along with my time and people like Bruce at all of our partnering institutes to hold these focus groups. So this is the kind of thing that we put out to try and get folks to participate. We're offering an incentive. And the key themes, we asked about climate impacts to agriculture. We also held 3 climate smart commodity advisor meetings, which went really well. There's a need for reliable regional specific predictions for increasingly frequent extreme weather. Extension educators noted that farmers often struggle to adopt sustainable practices without clear economic incentives or training. Many farmers, in terms of digital ag practices, especially those that are older in age, may not use technology or may hesitate to adopt digital ag tools. When we talked about AI in agriculture, some key themes, farmers have expressed concerns about data ownership, potential misuse by government agencies, liability issues. There needs to be transparency and practical applications rather than just being university-led abstract innovation. This is kind of that technology spectrum from very basic AI science to the more applied science. The farmers and extension really want something that's going to help them with their practices. And then concerns and barriers, again, security, AI reliability, and the exclusion of small farms. So I really wanted to touch on those key themes that Diego brought up and show you how they came and played out in the quotes from some of our focus groups. And they're really interesting. So in terms of interpretability of data, I will say a lot of growers are kind of tired of data. They don't need data. They need information to help make management decisions. That's coming from a California extension specialist. And then how do we turn to them into actionable management decisions that a producer can take that data and go, okay, now I know what to do with it, right? This is critical. In terms of accuracy, reliability, and relevance of ag data, ever since AI came out, any kind of search engine has significantly decreased in its quality. It's garbage coming out. Now you have to sort through it to find out more information to find something that's actually correct. In terms of data privacy, security, so one of the big issues I have with the AI is all my farmers want to know where the data is going. I still have the political deal that this data will then be used either by a government agency or the state or the water board or some kind of regulatory agency. So a lot of them have that political big brother syndrome, and a lot of them are hesitant of where this data is going to go and who's going to control it. In terms of unequal access, Climate Smart Commodities focus group participant said, when you get companies that are building these really advanced AI tools, they're going to sell them and recoup those costs. And so those might have the same accessibility issues as other tools, and they just might not be well developed for producers that don't have the scale or the ability to buy these tools. It's really exciting about technology and using these tools. Like, it could be a real game changer, but it just depends on what the tool is itself and how easy it is to use. In terms of technology adoption, this was a great focus group. It was with forestry consultants in New York. And the guy says, in my own experience, I've learned to look up and all the way down and all the way around. As a consultant, my clients expect me to be on the ground. I'm 70 and 72, and I may be too old to get into this new stuff. And finally, job security. This was brought up by a New York extension specialist. It's really scary when people talk about fear of job security. Even though AI can make things faster, you still need to have technical expertise. I thought this was kind of amazing when we held our first farmer focus group. This was a small-scale sustainable farmer, and we asked about hesitation about using AI, and his answer is, but in terms of AI, I'm actually someone who's frustrated with AI. I think when you're searching things on Google and AI is spitting out information, you can't get to the stuff that's not AI generated, and the information's always wrong. My opinion, it's not specific to science. It's completely made up. Also, just like the carbon footprint of it is anxiety producing. I feel like I want to build the soil, and then AI is actually degrading material somewhere else. Wow, this guy was very well informed. So finally, we asked about hesitation. What concerns do you have? And so down at the bottom, he says, yeah, so I think I'm curious when it comes to AI is because I grew up with the Terminator films. I'll just put that out there. And then he laughed. Yeah, who here doesn't think AI is going to be the end of it? End of us, let's just start with that. So I guess I would also say that we know, those of us that work on climate impacts and sustainability, we have to be really careful about how we talk about that issue with farmers. It's become politicized, unfortunately. The same thing with artificial intelligence. Don't just assume that farmers are going to be excited to use it. There's a lot of concerns about AI. And so key takeaways, I think I can leave this here for you. And there definitely are climate impacts we're seeing. Farmers recognize that. Farmers are trying to change practices. We found this in our climate impacts assessment in New York State. They are doing the best that they can, but they need research and tools. And we need to help them overcome those challenges. But in order to do that, we really need to engage farmers, ranchers, foresters, extension, and advisors when we're developing the tools. And I guess I want to make the point, I'm so glad to see this session here, and I'm so thankful that AI Climate has me and other social scientists, and I think if you're going to develop a NIFA proposal, please put a social scientist on it from the start and start this work from the beginning of your tool development. So thank you.
So we probably have time for one question. I'm seeing a hand up back there, so let me run back there to you. Unfortunately, we've got to break the wall back down and open up for the grower panel in a few minutes. But Connie, it's up to you.
Pretty loud. I'm just wondering. I heard you talk about stakeholders. I didn't hear farm workers mentioned once. I think about the dairy industry in New York. And I'm also curious as relates to AI climate. I know Purdue has done some interesting work. To me, one of the most under-researched areas is the economic impact of the inability to do work outdoors as a consequence of climate change. And we don't talk about, and also the increased mortality rate for workers. So curious if you want to, if any of that is tied into any of this.
Yes, definitely heat stress for not only crops and livestock, but farm workers. It came up in our climate impacts assessment for New York State. So I encourage you to look at that document. It's very thorough. And when I meant farmers, I meant farm workers as well. We're actually doing training with the New York Northeast Climate Hub with urban farmers in New York City. And a lot of those are not farm owners. They're farm workers. And they work maybe at one farm, small scale farm, and then it's a challenge because they don't make the decisions often, but they can be engaged in the process. But if you have suggestions, Cornell, that's a good point. Cornell does have a farm worker program. It's a great point. Thank you.
Well, thanks again, Allison. Really appreciate it. Please.
Thank you.
So they're going to go ahead and break the wall down. In 10 minutes from now, we need to be in there for the farmer panel, which you do not want to miss. So please do what you need to do and be in there in 10 minutes. Thank you.